this. Okay, so I am going to do a really brief presentation here on the basics of hormones and give you kind of an introduction to that. I think that's it. Yes. Okay, so you should be able to see this. Yes? So animal hormones, we're just going to stick with animal hormones. We can go into plant hormones, but I think we just don't have time this year to do that. So we're just going to stick with animal hormones. And before we go into specifics, I wanted to point out that there are two different types of animal hormones, categories. Sometimes they're made of steroids, which means they're in the lipid group, right? Steroid hormones include the sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. Now, these are lipid soluble, and what that means is that their reception step actually happens in the cytoplasm because they can go right through the phospholipid layer. All steroids can do that. Steroids are kind of made of lipid themselves, and so they're not bothered by those nonpolar phospholipid tails that are a barrier to most other things. So steroid hormones can go right through there. They get received by a receptor molecule. You still have a reception step, but then you don't tend to have a very long cascade, phosphorylation cascade, like we showed you with epinephrine. And a lot of steroid hormones, their final responses tend to be they go right into the nucleus with the receptor, and that stimulates one of the genes in the DNA to start making a new protein. So very often, that's what a steroid hormone will do. But we're going to talk about testosterone next week, not this week. This week, we're going to stick with protein hormones. Now, protein hormones, we've already talked about one. Epinephrine, that big, long example that we talked about the last time we talked about hormones, which was 2 classes ago. Epinephrine is an example of a protein hormone. Its receptor is in the cell membrane, right? It's embedded in there, and Mr. Anderson walked all through that, and we did that, remember, a couple classes back. So it can't get into the cell. It's barred from the cell membrane because those phospholipid tails will keep proteins out because they're polar. They're not made of lipid like steroid hormones are. So protein hormones, and most of the ones that we'll talk about are protein hormones, have to meet with a receptor in the membrane and then send the message inside without going inside. So like the G protein cascade that we talked about last time is what protein hormones have to do. So the ones that we'll be talking about today, we talked about epinephrine already, so we're done with epinephrine. But we're going to be talking about 2 very important hormones today, insulin and glucagon. These are protein hormones that actually are antagonistic to each other. Most of you have heard of insulin, and now you kind of understand why I was asking you what your favorite sugary treats were, because we're going to talk a lot about blood sugar today and how you regulate that. So you probably have heard of insulin, and that insulin has to do with your blood sugar. There's a companion hormone to insulin, though. It's called glucagon. These are both protein hormones. They're different protein hormones, and they have opposite effects on blood sugar, on glucose. So I'm going to add a little bit of drawing to this. Okay. All right. So now again, I am recording this, so if you didn't get all that written down, don't worry. You can look at it later. Okay. All right. So let's talk for a minute about insulin and glucagon. Okay. Insulin and glucagon. These are called antagonistic hormones, meaning they have the opposite effects on blood sugar. They are both secreted by an organ called the pancreas. They're both secreted by the pancreas, which is kind of a mottled organ that is located right underneath your stomach. And the pancreas secretes these two hormones depending on what your blood sugar level is, right? So here's what each one of them does. Insulin lowers blood glucose. And the way it does this by signaling body cells, right, in your muscles and your brain and other places, body cells, to put glucose channels, which are protein channels, right, that let glucose in, into their membranes. Okay, what this means is the glucose that builds up in your blood after you've eaten all of those chocolate donuts, glucose leaves your blood and enters your cells. Okay. That's how insulin works. Insulin is a signal that once it signals a muscle cell or a liver cell or brain cell or fat cell, those, like the muscle cell, will receive the insulin signal, and inside what happens is glucose channels sort of float up to the cell membrane and put themselves there. So all of a sudden you have a bunch of glucose doorways in the cell that weren't there before, and then all the glucose that's floating around outside the cell comes in massive transports, high in the blood, low inside the cell. It flows in and your blood sugar lowers back to normal. That's what insulin does when it's working correctly. Okay. Glucagon obviously has the opposite effect. Glucagon raises blood glucose, like say it's, I don't know, 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you forgot to eat both breakfast and lunch. You just didn't eat. You were busy with other things, you were whatever you were doing, you forgot to eat. And your blood glucose got really, really, really low. Glucagon then is released also by the pancreas. And what it does is actually really similar, and I hope you don't get confused by this, but it actually does something very similar to epinephrine. It's just that it's not a fight or flight situation. You're just hungry because you didn't eat, right? There's no bear chasing you. But what it does is it signals those liver cells again. Very useful, liver cells. Signals liver cells, and you know that liver cells have all that glycogen in storage, right? To release glucose from storage, right? From stored glycogen. Therefore, glucose leaves cells and enters the blood. There. So glucagon has the opposite effect. Of insulin, right? And it just depends on the pancreas. Which is an organ. It kind of looks like that, right? And the pancreas has a built-in glucometer inside it. The pancreas has a way to constantly be measuring your blood sugar. And if it gets too high, it sends out insulin into your blood, which goes to find your body cells and puts glucose doorways into them so they can take the glucose out of the blood. If the blood sugar gets too low, the pancreas stops secreting insulin and starts secreting glucagon, which goes to the liver and releases glucose from stored glycogen. Okay? So there's one other little piece here that I want you to read, which kind of goes along with this. Leave this behind. Again, this is all recorded, so you can go get it later, right? Let's just take a look at this for a second. So many hormone pathways work by a negative feedback mechanism. Because once you start a response, you need to be able to stop it. So negative feedback usually works like this. There's an initial response chemical which goes to signal release of other response chemicals. And the final response builds up, and when it reaches a certain concentration, it goes back to turn off the first chemical signal. The situation with insulin and glucagon that I just told you about is like a double negative feedback pathway. So let me just give you an example, and then you tell me how it would finish. Example. You eat 12 chocolate donuts. What's going to happen? First, second, third, fourth. Think about it in your mind for a minute. What is the feedback pathway that's going to happen here? So you eat those 12 chocolate donuts, first of all. Yep. Sorry, I gotta go over here, yes. Insulin will activate, but before it activates, what happens before that? Once they're digested, yeah, okay, there you go. Yeah, okay, so let's make sure that we write it in a logical order. You're not incorrect. I just want to make sure we get all the steps. So first of all, the donut is digested, right? The food is digested, and glucose enters bloodstream, right? Okay, and then I liked the way you said it. Glucose in blood spikes. It goes way up. Okay. What's the organ that's going to detect this? Which organ measures the blood glucose and determines that it's too high? I'm sure you're saying the pancreas. That's correct. Yes. Okay. The pancreas measures blood sugar. And as a consequence, now what do? It secretes what? Which chemical? Insulin. Very good. It secretes insulin. Okay. What does the insulin do? The insulin is a hormone. It's going to go to the target cells in muscles and fat in your brain cells. And what will the insulin signal those cells to do? Good. The insulin signals body cells to put glucose channels, right? Or glucose doorways, however you want to say it. Glucose channels in membranes, a whole bunch of them, and that means that the glucose will flow into the cells and out of the blood, right? Glucose flows in into the body cells that need it, right? Because they want that glucose for glycolysis and then to send in all those respiration steps in the Krebs cycle and the ETC to make ATP, right? Okay, flows into cells. We're going to start breaking it down, and that also lowers blood sugar and out of the blood, right? Okay. So this is the problem with my body is that, or with a diabetic's body, these are the steps that don't work so well, right? So with the diabetic type 1, I'm not a type 1, I'm a type 2. A type 2 person, the problem is the receiving of the signal. This is my problem right here. I make plenty of insulin. Type 2 diabetics make a lot of insulin. That's not the problem. The problem is that the body cells in my body just don't receive or respond to the insulin as well as yours do if you're a healthy person, right? So diabetes type 2, the issue is here. Type 2. The reception of the signal just doesn't work very well. Type 1 diabetes, the problem is here. Diabetes type 1, usually the problem is that the pancreas has been damaged somehow. Often it's autoimmune disease that does it, or it can be cancer that does it. It can be you were in a car accident. There's lots of different things that might have happened, or some people are born with pancreases that aren't fully developed. But their problem is that they're not, the pancreatic cells are not secreting insulin, sometimes not at all. So they are the ones that in order to survive having diabetes type 1, you need insulin injections. You need insulin injections. You can't get by with some of the medications that I take that help my cells to receive signals better, or help my glycogen storage versus non-storage situation. So I can do that because I do have insulin in my body. But a type 1 person, you need to have injections of insulin in order to survive. Okay, so any questions about that? It's a pretty fascinating topic. All right. So then what about glucagon? With glucagon, what situation would, like, if I had, and this has happened to me actually, I took medication for the very first time when I was about 26. That was the first time they discovered that I had diabetes. And the medication that I took went too far. And what I can tell you is it's just as dangerous for your blood sugar to go too high as it is for it to go too low. And my blood sugar plummeted, and I didn't know that it would do that. And I don't think the doctors did either. They were trying to figure out what dosage to give me. So my blood sugar went too low. The medication they gave me was too powerful. What happened was I was actually in Ithaca unloading my musical equipment. My husband and I, he wasn't my husband yet, we were going to play a gig in a little coffee house, and I was unloading all this heavy equipment by myself because my husband, well, my boyfriend wasn't there yet. He hadn't gotten there yet. And the people in the cafe were being really nice. They were trying to help me out. But I was shaking and sweating because the medicine had taken my blood glucose down too low. And if you know anything about that, it can give you lots of very anxious type, shaky, sweaty symptoms. And in fact, it also kind of put me in a bit of a temper. I was really snapping at people. And this is really unlike me. I'm not that kind of a person at all. And I was finally stopped and realized how I was acting. And I went over to the bar and I said, "Do you have any oranges?" And the guy just handed me over oranges because I think by that time they were thinking, "Oh my gosh, this chick's really angry. Let's just, whatever she wants, let's just give her the oranges." So he gave me a dish full of oranges, and I just sat there and ate the oranges until my blood sugar went back up and I calmed down. I was like, "Oh wow, okay, sorry everyone." Sorry about that. So blood sugar can have a very, very strong effect on your behavior and on your body. Going low is actually pretty dangerous. I don't know how low it actually went. Not so low that I couldn't function and ask for the oranges, luckily. Okay, so any questions? So what other chemical was probably trying to work in my body aside from me eating those oranges? What was the natural chemical that should be secreted by my pancreas if my blood sugar gets too low? Yes, glucagon, that's it. Okay. So the antagonistic hormone that would be at work here and was probably at work when I was when my body was freaking out because my blood sugar went too low, right? So if blood glucose goes too low, the pancreas secretes glucagon, okay, which is the antagonistic hormone to insulin. And what does glucagon do? What will it go do? Come on, one last thing and then we're done. Come on. Glucagon does the opposite of insulin, sort of. It's going to raise the blood glucose back up. But where is it going to get glucose? Yes, it breaks down glycogen in the liver. That's it. That's how you do it. Yes. Okay, that's it. Right. Exactly right. Okay. All right, so that's my beginning talk on insulin and glucagon. I'm going to stop the recording.